everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Stars and Stripes Cricket Podcast presented by DreamCricket. I'm your host, Peter Della Penna, and on this episode, I welcome Emmy Award-winning sports director and producer, Peter Steep, who many people would know if they're involved in the broadcasting industry through his work in Minor League Cricket Season 2, and he's also synonymous with a lot of broadcasts that have been done out of the West Indies and other things inside and outside of America, including the Cricket All-Stars Tour that was in 2015. His expertise goes well beyond cricket into golf, tennis, on the U.S. Open Grand Slam tennis tournaments right outside of his home in Queens, New York. And he's done Olympic broadcasts. He's done a hell of a lot of work outside of sports as well. There's so many things that Peter Steep has done in his career that he has anecdotes galore. And he's sharing a lot of those on this interview in the podcast, which is going to be split up into 2 episodes because his anecdotes are just that good. Stay tuned for the interview with Peter Steep, but before we get to that, I want to first thank the newest Patreon subscriber, the newest Patriots, Crystal Zins. Crystal, thank you so much for becoming a Patriot. And if you haven't listened to Crystal's interview and episode on the Stars and Stripes Cricket Podcast, I encourage everybody to do so. Being born and raised in Minnesota and getting into cricket over the last 3 years, and she shared that story in episode 49. So if you haven't listened to that yet, by all means, go on to YouTube, Spotify, Anchor FM, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get the podcast, subscribe, and you can get the episode with Crystal Zins. You can get this episode with Peter Steep and all other episodes in the Stars and Stripes Cricket Podcast catalog. But Crystal, thanks again for your support on the podcast, and if you have not done so, go to patreon.com. For as little as $3 a month, you can support the podcast and help keep it going on an episode-by-episode basis. And Peter Steep is also a longtime supporter of the podcast as a Patriot, so thank you to Peter, thank you to Crystal, and thank you to everybody else who supports the podcast. I also want to thank the sponsors of the podcast, DreamCricket. They can help you fill up all of your cricket kit requirements. Anything you need, bats, helmets, gloves, pads, jerseys. Go to DreamCricketStore.com now and get 15% off your first order. DreamCricket Store also offers free shipping on all orders over $200. So go to www.DreamCricketStore.com to take advantage of those great deals today. Stars and Stripes Cricket Podcast is also sponsored by Moosa Cricket Stadium, the first turf wicket facility in the state of Texas. For more information, go to www.moosastadium.com. That's MOOSA Stadium.com. And also, Crickbuster. We're closing in now on the start of the T20 World Cup in Australia. It's under 2 weeks away from the first matches in the opening round, but there's still time. If you haven't booked your trip yet, Crickbuster is your one-stop shop for everything to do with the men's T20 World Cup in Australia this October. Crickbuster is an ICC designated official travel agent. So if you're a cricket fan living in the USA and you're thinking about going down there last minute, by all means, get in touch with Crickbuster for all of your touring plans. Visit www.crickbuster.com to begin planning your trip today. And now, part 1 of the interview with Peter Steep. Today's episode of the Stars and Stripes Cricket Podcast presented by DreamCricket. I'm joined by Peter Steep, who, if you work in the cricket broadcasting industry, you would know his name very well, whether that's in America or well beyond that. Peter is director, producer, not just for cricket, a hell of a lot of other sports too. We can talk about that. And he has led a very interesting life beyond cricket as well, which I've just discovered a little bit about, sheep shearing, among other things. So, Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Peter, or should I say the master of the man cat.
I've had to put on pause all my screenshot and documentation to do this interview with you, Peter.
You've been inundated with people around the world loving your streams on the man cat, or the so-called man cat issue.
It's kept me busy. My favorite point that people keep bringing up in a lot of the responses, man, this guy's got no life. He must be a virgin. Go find a woman. All right. Well, I am a cricket journalist. I am paid to do these things. This is my full-time job, to do this kind of research and do these kind of things. And I am married with one daughter. So there is evidence that at least once in my life, I have.
You've been away from cricket, yes.
I've been away from cricket.
So, that way, yeah.
So I know you I got to know you first through my initial opportunities doing broadcasting commentary. It was at the Super 50 down in Trinidad, I believe, was the first
That's
time I met
right.
you down in November 2019, and we've worked together on the minor league cricket broadcasts on Willow TV. So I know you through that, but you've been in the broadcast industry for decades, going on 30 years now. You're Australian, in case people couldn't tell from hearing your initial
No,
response.
I don't have an accent. You do. Yeah.
You know, you're in Queens now. So let me ask you, Queens, New York, just be specific. I wore my Mets shirt just for you, Peter, because I know you're by Citi Field.
Yeah. That's an interesting story. When I first moved to the US in 1988, my future mother-in-law figured that I should be immersed immediately into the local culture. She got me tickets for the Mets-Dodgers game. That was the year that the Kirk Gibson home run, if you recall.
Well,
it wasn't that match.
For Mets fans, we remember as the Mike Scioscia series, the devastating Mike Scioscia 2-home run game against Doc Gooden.
And I live about 2.5 miles from Citi Field, or Shea Stadium, of course, as it was, as my wife still refers to it. And I became an instant Mets fan, not knowing the difference much then between Yankees or Mets. And I'm thinking back now, had she got me Yankees tickets, I might have been on the dark side all these years as a Yankees fan. So I was very grateful to her for providing Mets tickets and not Yankees tickets.
Well, this is quite fascinating for me, talking to somebody who's a Mets fan who's never experienced winning World Series before. You know, you came in 2 years after the fact.
That's right.
You've only known it heartbreak, essentially.
Yeah. But I do laugh when I'm at a Mets game and the young fellas, you know, they hear me speaking. I don't sound like I come from Queens yet, I don't think. And they say, oh, what are you foreigners here doing, you know, pretending to be a Mets fan? And I say, how long have you been a Mets fan? The guy will go, all my life. And I'll say, and how long is that? He said, well, I'm 20. I go, well, I've been a Mets fan for 33 years now, and I still haven't seen them win the World Series. Close-ish in 2000. And 2015 was a huge disappointment against the Royals for me. But that was too much. And that was the year we did the cricket at Citi Field. That's another story.
Well, yeah. And almost, you know, if you look at the dates, most people think on a traditional year for the Mets, because they've not been to the playoffs quite often over the span of the last 30 years. You could usually say, like, oh, well, you can get away with scheduling the Cricket All-Stars in mid-October because the Mets aren't going to go to the playoffs, and they go to the World Series that year. So you had no choice. You had to wait until the World Series ended before you could do the game at Citi Field.
See, Game 5, was it? Game 6 at Citi Field. It was to be played on the Sunday. We were supposed to be playing the first match of the 3-match series the following Saturday. And the Mets organization we'd been dealing with for quite a while about setting up for cricket. And some of the meetings were quite interesting when the ground supervisor in the first meeting, when we described what we'd do, he'd say, you're going to do what to my field? We were going to bring semi-trailers and cranes into the middle of the Citi Field to put a drop-in pitch in there. And of course, that was to be done. We had the trucks waiting outside the city limits of New York on that Sunday night, waiting to know whether there was going to be another match. And that, according to the rules of hauling, the pitch that was being brought in on the truck, they weren't allowed to come into the city limits before a certain time of the day because of traffic restrictions. So they were hovering outside the area of Citi Field, and we ended up bringing them in at 2 o'clock in the morning after the match had finished, and started preparing to dig up the ground to put the pitch in. And
for people who don't know, that drop-in wicket was being prepared in Indianapolis. So this is quite an extensive operation to drive it from Indianapolis in Indiana, basically 1,000 miles east, to get it to New York City. And then only to be told, according to you, you're not allowed to enter the city limits. You got to wait outside.
That's right. So they were driving around for hours, so waiting to be called to say, yes, now you're permitted to come in and commence this duty. It was quite something. And I remember when the players, as we had them gathered, they wanted to practice on it, of course, because this whole new idea of these players being brought together for this series as a showcase for cricket in the United States, they were really concerned that about the surface that they were going to play on, because they were told they were going to be playing in a baseball ground, and they were really concerned about it. So we had the wicket was put in on the Wednesday, but it was finished on the Wednesday. They could come practice on the Thursday, and we're out there. They had put nets around the actual wicket, and they were bowling on it, and watching Shoaib Akhtar bowling on that thing, and Curtly Ambrose. I mean, it was just like still an eye-opener for me, just thinking back on it. And Ricky Ponting came up to me and said, well, you guys have done a pretty good job. And I said, it wasn't me. It was this gentleman here, the famous Kiwi who built the wickets. And he also built, Peter, wicket for the Minute Maid Park ground in Houston, as well as a separate one for Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles. So it went really well, and it's just a pity that it kind of petered out after that. But we were just surprised at the gathering of the talent there. It was a super galaxy of cricket talent.
Yeah, Mark Parham, he was the curator from New Zealand.
Yeah.
Who came in. He had done work previously in the U.S. He had helped get the facility in Indianapolis up and running, the actual cricket facility there, not the indoor facility where he was doing the drop-in wicket preparation, but there's a separate facility called World Sports Park on the east side of Indianapolis. And he was heavily involved in the design and the cultivation of that facility, the outfield and the square itself. And it's a shame that that facility doesn't get used anymore, because I felt it was one of the best facilities.
Obviously, the baseball grounds aren't the ideal venues for cricket, but at the time they needed places where they could attract a crowd to kind of pay for it. Now, really, we looked at everywhere around the US, at various grounds, but the baseball grounds seemed to be the place to do it. And funnily enough, the people at Citi Field were really good, but they wouldn't let us remove the pitcher's mound. So it was covered over with a logo, a tarped logo. Now, in Minute Maid Park, they didn't care. Yeah, you can do whatever you want. You can move it. So it was quite interesting seeing the attitude towards what we were doing from the different grounds that we played it on.
Well, you have to keep in mind, at that point in time, the Mets were in the World Series. The Mets were the best team in the National League. They won the pennant. People forget this. At that point in time, the Astros were the worst team in baseball.
Yeah.
So, in really a short space of time, in the space of 3 years, basically, they went from being one of the worst teams in baseball to being a World Series winner and a consistent winner, or a team appearing in the World Series.
With the help of certain cameras. Right?
They had a little bit of sleight of hand there. But the point is, the mentality changes. When you're a last place team and you're losing 100 games, like they were in the early part of the 2010s, you don't mind so much if people are altering your field if it brings in revenue.
The people at Citi Field, the funny thing was, we go out to do a survey where I had to walk around the outfield or the warning track to know where we're going to put the cameras. And I went to step out onto the grass to look back to get a perspective view. And the security guys there said, you are not permitted to set foot on this grass unless you're a major league player. And I went, okay, well, you don't know what's going to happen here later in the week when we're doing clinics for 300 kids. But anyway, that was another story too.
Well, it seems like that now. It's very weird, the progression over the years, because I remember when I was a kid, me and my brothers, I got two older brothers, and my dad, we used to take these road trips every year where my dad would take some time off from the family construction business, and he would take us out to see a different Major League Baseball stadium every summer. And we would put other things into these trips as well. So one year we went out to Chicago and we saw games both at the new Comiskey Park, as it was called at the time. Yeah. It was the very first year that the new Comiskey Park had opened. And we saw games at Wrigley Field as well. But on the way there, we stopped at Notre Dame and we did a kind of a tour of Notre Dame, and we went out onto the football field there. And at the time, this is early 90s, and going into the field at Notre Dame Stadium, this hallowed, revered thing, and you're going to see Touchdown Jesus and all that.
Sure. Yeah.
You could walk onto the field. There was no security. Nobody cared.
No problem.
And there were other people there. I mean, there wasn't hundreds, but there was a half dozen of us who we were just generally curious. And we walked out onto the field. We walked into the end zone, and we pretended like we played for Notre Dame. We just scored a touchdown or whatever. and nobody cared. It was like, oh, all right, these people are just walking on the grass. Fast forward now, to the 2010s, and they're very, very fussy and particular about it because there's so many millions, hundreds of millions poured into these.
Yeah, a lot of money there.
And I remember the U.S. Under-19 team last summer or summer 2021. They had a training camp in San Francisco, Santa Clara, and as part of the training camp, they were invited to Levi's Stadium for a day.
Mm-hmm.
And because Parag Marathe, who's the vice president of the 49ers, was also the chairman of the USA Cricket Board at the time, wanted to welcome the players to where the San Francisco 49ers play. So they went to Levi's Stadium, and I was there to take photos for the team on the day and cover the event. And what you said just happened. Same thing. They get shown in the locker room. They get shown the other parts of the underneath the stadium, all this kind of behind the scenes stuff. And then some PR staff instruct everybody as we're walking out onto the field. Before we could get to the field, we never actually set foot on the field because what happened? Well, you just said we get out of the tunnel. The guys are like really excited to think like, oh, we're going to walk onto the field to play Levi Stadium and like pretend we're going to be 49ers. One of the players, he puts one foot on the edge of the end zone grass. Not even like the end zone itself. We're not even talking about the field to play end zone. He's not even on the grass that leads to the end zone painted white lines that mark off the end of the end zone. We're in the grass before that. And in the grass before you get to the white line part of the end zone, a couple security officials stop and say, hold on a second. You cannot set foot on this grass. This is protected. And any part of the grass, I mean, they treat it as an investment.
They're extremely serious about it.
Do not touch or else we will sick the guard dogs on you.
Well, I was hoping that same person that pulled me up that day was going to be there later in the week, because we literally had a couple of hundred kids there from various schools around New York City doing clinics with some of these great cricketers. And City Field was covered with people. And so I thought it was a little bit odd that, 2 days before I wasn't allowed to set foot on the grass because it was hallowed ground for Major League players only. And of course, I didn't quite make Major League level.
This is where Benny Agbayani once ran around.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, and of course, then the Pepsi sign in right field. Was this one of the landmarks of New York City at the time.
The Pepsi porch.
Pepsi porch, and of course, we were out there practicing. We were doing pieces with Matty Hayden and Andrew Simons, and they were hitting balls over the Pepsi sign. So the City Field people were like aghast. They thinking, oh man, this is good. So they had to go out and take another $5 million worth of insurance out on that Pepsi sign because they were worried that it was going to get hit with cricket balls. So it had never, obviously, no one ever gets near it playing baseball, but you got guys get like, Andrew Simons, as you know, can launch them. So that was an interesting aspect of it too. They had no idea how hard these guys hit the ball.
And if you think about it just from a contextual standpoint, in a baseball game, you might clear it a couple times a game. And in batting practice, at that point in time, Yoenis Cespedes was like the king of the Mets that season and when they went to the World Series. And so, you go to batting practice, you see Yoenis Cespedes trying to hit however many home runs in batting practice, and you've got fans out there. But you've got people intercepting these objects, all trying to catch a home run ball. And so the actual prospect of there being damage to the facility doesn't really exist. Whereas if it's in an empty stadium in a training session like that, all of a sudden, or in a game itself, where instead of it being 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 home runs over the course of a game, if the boundaries are short because the cricket dimensions are different, and you've got 15, 20, 36s potentially providing damage to these structures, it makes sense that they might need to take out extra insurance.
Well, Minute Maid Park was slightly different. If people watching this who are familiar with Minute Maid Park know that every time there's a home run hit there's a guy out there in this little train that goes backwards and forwards, celebrating the home run. So they thought it'd be a cool idea to do that every time one of our guys hit a 6. So
I remember he was busy. He was very, very busy.
It all went off. The thing broke down halfway through the match because there were so many sixes being hit. So that was interesting. I think we broke the train. Yeah.
I remember that as well. After a certain point in time, the train was not going back and forth for each six.
Didn't work. Yeah.
I want to go back to the City Field though. It's one of the early points you touched on. They realized kind of midway through the week that this is not usual, and one of the things you said was about the pitcher's mound and how they were very protective of the pitcher's mound and what to do with that. I mean, there are a lot of events that happen at Shea Stadium and City Field that has taken the place of Shea Stadium since 2008, 2009. But, there are plenty of non-baseball events that happen. Yeah. I mean,
the New York City Football Club plays there now.
Well, there's that. But, you can at least theorize that being a sanctioned sporting facility. And also, if you look at Yankee Stadium, they have the New Era Pinstripe Bowl every year, the college football game that gets reconfigured to play at Yankee Stadium on the outfield. But other events that could, in theory, damage the field of play, right? Mm-hmm. All sorts of concerts. However many Billy Joel concerts there have been over the years in that stadium, in addition to God knows how many other acts. But there's all sorts of horror stories you hear, whether it's Rolling Stones concerts or other events where there's 60,000 people who are not in the seats. You've got 10,000, 15,000 out of those people who are on the grass in close to the stage VIP section. And if it rains, it's just mayhem. They just the weight of the people and the spectators on the field of play during a concert can just wreck everything there. So logistically, from that standpoint, when you talk about the pitcher's mound being protected and all that, from your knowledge of how you were involved in the event, kind of in a production sense, what were the challenges and differences that were, I guess, similar to any other sporting event versus how it kind of compared and related to something like a Billy Joel concert or a non-sporting event that were causes of concern and challenges that needed to be catered to make the Cricket All-Stars event happen?
Well, in terms of covering it production-wise, because this thing, it went all over the world, and we were dealing, I think the main problems I had was dealing with the guys in India about how we were going to produce it. But in terms of covering it as a cricket event per se, there were no problems at all. We had to make some slight adjustments in some of where we could put the cameras, but essentially it was just like a normal coverage. One of the challenges was to let the people at City Field know that we weren't going to be trying to damage anything. We weren't trying to present the venue in any other way than what it is, a great sporting venue. But in terms of the actual coverage itself of a sporting event, it was fairly routine for us. Of course, the crew that I assembled for it had decades of experience doing cricket, so it was just another venue for them. It was a little different in some of the setups, but for all intents and purposes, it was just another cricket series.
In terms of it, like camera setups you touched on there, right? So it's configured for baseball. The camera wells are positioned, to be in line with the first base line and third base line to, get down the line if there's a home run versus a foul ball or anything else that's a fair ball, foul ball scenario. And then you've got obviously the home plate camera, you've got the center field camera, you've got some different cameras set up around the stadium. How much adapting did you need to do to try and put on a production to get cameras in position so that they would be more amenable to your traditional cricket camera angles, whether that's side on or front on?
Well, the normal wicket to wicket and ball follow cameras at both ends, the only difference we found there was slight elevation difference. Obviously, when we set up at a regular ground, we like to have both ends set up the same elevation so that the look of the bowlers over the bowler's arm is the same from both ends. We had a little bit of a difference there because the way it was set up. In terms of the lineup of it, it was fine. The slips cameras, which are traditionally at ground level on normal coverage, that was no problem. We had to have them hard up against the wall. On one end, actually, we had them in the first row of the viewing area rather than at ground level. Mid-wicket camera was fine. There was, because it is a stadium, we could kill seats if we needed to for our camera positions. And the biggest challenge that we had trying to explain to the people there was the run-out cameras, because they don't have that traditionally, the need for cameras in those positions for baseball coverage, of course. setting up the run-out cameras was a little bit of a challenge, but in general, the grounds themselves were quite amenable to, or quite suitable for setting up cricket. The problem was that the dimensions of the grounds just don't fit properly for proper cricket, because you're playing cricket in the middle of the ground and it just makes the boundaries too short. But, you know, we had to make compromises to make it pay.
So, for example, having bowlers at the same, having cameras at the same vantage point behind each bowler's arm. If you've got one, if the traditional one behind home plate is on like the second or third level, I know where the city, the SNY broadcast booth is.
Third level at it's right below the SNY.
It's in like the mezzanine level is where they are behind home plate. So it's like right next to the rest of the media box. They've got the SNY booth, and then they've got the cameras right there. But from center field, you've got a different vantage point.
It's a lower look. Yeah, it's a much your normal camera 1 and 2 coverage from baseball is a lower elevation, because as they're set up, it's standardized throughout baseball at the looking from center field over the pitcher's arm, and it's not exactly behind. Unlike cricket, it's not exactly behind the pitcher, even though it may appear to some people watching baseball that it is, but it isn't. And so that level was slightly different. We tried to get as close as we could by not using that area and going up into the next level, which meant we had to kill some seats to try and match the elevation at the other end. But you could hardly tell. If you go back and look at the replays, you could hardly tell the difference. But that was a challenge on all the grounds, particularly Dodger Stadium.
Just because at Dodger Stadium in the outfield, you don't have anything that's kind of elevated in the same sense that you do at
you don't.
And
it seems much bigger. It has a much bigger feel to it when you're in Dodger Stadium, to me, than Citi Field at the time. So,
but it's more kind of, how do I put it? It's more sprawling.
Yeah, it is. It is. That's the way to put it. At the end, the coverage of the cricket was fine as well. We had no problem because of the the lenses we use. That's no problem at all. It turned out a much better look than we kind of expected at the beginning.
All right, so let me ask you this: going back to just your roots in New York, what is it like being in New York City now for the last 34 years, and also simultaneously living this very intense life in the cricket broadcast world? I mean, when you're away from tours and back in New York City, do you kind of enjoy the anonymity that being in a climate where there's no cricket to kind of...
Greatest city in the world to be anonymous is New York City. That's there's no doubt about it. I love to go down to Cunningham Park, which is only a mile away from my house, and I can sit there and have a beer and watch the guys play cricket on the weekend in social matches, or take a walk or a bicycle ride over to Flushing Meadows in Corona and watch cricket there. My wife, who's from Queens, has had to put up with a lot of my cricket travails over the years, but she rests warmly with the knowledge that my mother, when she first met her, and we were watching cricket at my house in Australia, and of course my wife Gail knew nothing about cricket, and my mum told her that she had a dispensation from our family that she didn't need to learn about it. So she's still living on that 34 years later.
But the culture of New York, I mean, it started off by saying, yeah, you can be anonymous in New York, but then you just pivoted straight to, I can go to Corona Park, Flushing Meadows Park, Cunningham Park. Literally, I mean, right outside Citi Field. Everybody thinks of Flushing Meadows Park as the home of the U.S. Open for tennis, Grand Slam tennis, right? But literally, you walk outside the U.S. Tennis Center, you walk past that big globe, which everybody remembers as being synonymous with the World's Fair back in 19.
That's right.
Right. And literally, like 50 yards beyond that,
there's cricket matches everywhere.
There's cricket fields everywhere.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't know that.
Well, people are astonished to find out that New York City alone has 120 clubs, separate clubs. They think, how is that possible? But it's all played. Cricket play is played, obviously, at social level, and it very rarely goes beyond that.
Have you ever played in New York?
I've played in New York, sure, yeah. When I first moved here, we used to play all the time. We actually played in Central Park. We had my first cricket match in the US was in Central Park in New York. We had the Australian consulate used to put on it was really an excuse to get together for a few beers with the guys. And we used to play against various other consul generals teams. And we ended up having an annual match against the Marion Cricket Club, which was always good. And we ended up going down there more than they came to New York, because for obvious reasons, Marion Cricket Ground is a lovely place to play cricket. And I'm very, very fortunate, and I love to tell my cricket family back home that my team photo of playing cricket hangs in a wall just about 20 meters down the hall in Marion from the photo of Don Bradman playing at the same ground. So I was pretty happy to be in that company, even though I think I made 2 not out, and the last time I played there, and I think the last time I played there, I was run out without facing the ball. So, that was my level of expertise. But to play at a place like Marion, which again has a lot of cricket history, is remarkable. And the university it's attached to Villanova, right? Villanova has an association. There's the library there, the cricket library.
Well, you got Haverford. So at Haverford College.
Yeah, Haverford College. I'm sorry. The historians of cricket in the UK send people there to do research on cricket. People don't realise that the extent of cricket in the country, and of course, it's fairly common knowledge that the first international match between the US and Canada, that gets bandied around a lot. But apart from that, there is a lot of cricket in the US.
Well, that you referenced playing with and against Marion. So that match, I'm fairly certain that it still goes on in some capacity. There's a consulate team. Yeah. Where they get a team that visits from Philadelphia. Sometimes it's the British Officers Club. Sometimes it's Marion. Sometimes it might be a different team from Philadelphia. But that match with a consulate team against a consulate team in New York still takes place to this day. And but again, touching on Marion, there's so much history, cricket history and cricket culture in the Northeast, New York and Philadelphia in particular. I mean, Marion, and it's linked to so many other sports too. Talk about Corona Park having the cricket fields literally within walking distance of the U.S. Tennis Center. And at Marion, right? Marion is this gorgeous facility for people who haven't been there or haven't heard of it. It's got this magnificent pavilion. And it's like white glove service. The MCC had a tour there in 2016 where they had the MCC women's team, and Charlotte Edwards was part of the MCC women's team that toured to play against the USA team, and they played at Marion. And I remember Charlotte Edwards saying that she thought it was just like going to Wimbledon. I mean, because you had not just the cricket field there in front of the pavilion, but you've got these lawn tennis courts, and you've got all these other courts. And you go inside the pavilion, and again, it's white glove service. Like there's a
it is really a tennis club when it boils down to it, because that's the way they make their money, Peter.
Yeah,
the majority of the year. We were allowed to play our matches in the spring before they closed off the area for cricket, so that they could convert them for grass court tennis for the rest of the summer. So that they could charge the members. So it was really it's become more of a tennis facility than a cricket facility, but still playing on it. It's like a billiard table playing on it. The surface is beautiful to bat on and field on. So that's absolutely lovely.
And Philadelphia Cricket Club is the same way. So Philadelphia Cricket Club, Marion Cricket Club, you can play for, I think it's either 5 or 6 weeks in the spring and 5 or 6 weeks in the fall. They have it set up for cricket, but then the rest of the summer, the membership wants it converted for lawn tennis courts. So this magnificent outfield that's cut so low and lush for cricket, even though they would use a matting strip. So they use the coconut jute matting to put down for a cricket wicket. They don't have an actual square shape down, but they do that also to protect it for the lawn tennis. But for the majority of the summer, it's lawn tennis courts that they put in there for the outfield for use.
The Major League Cricket people had us. We went down last year to do a survey there to look at it as a possible venue for a demonstration match for the upcoming Major League season. And we went through all the motions of, setting out how we would do, what we would need, all the logistics. And it came back, just turned out a little bit too expensive for them to pay the freight on for one day that they wanted to charge. But it would have been a nice place to do it. But I don't think they obviously needed the attention.
Oh yeah, it's a vice versa proposition. They didn't need it. Cricket would have loved to have it. They could live without it.
Major League Cricket would have loved it. Yeah,
because again, it's literally right across the street. You've got Marion Golf Club, which was it 4 or 5 years ago. It's part of the rotation for hosting U.S. Open.
2013 was the last one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Justin Rose won. Yeah.
So they've got U.S. Open golf major championships that they host there. That anybody who knows golf would know Marion. And in fact, I stayed with somebody in Glasgow, and I was working on the broadcast for the Nepal, Namibia, Scotland series in Glasgow at Titwood this summer. The Airbnb host I stayed with, I was in a place literally overlooking the ground at Titwood in Clydesdale in that part of Glasgow. And I just had to walk out 30 feet outside my Airbnb to get to the cricket ground daily for the ICC TV broadcast. But my host was a huge golf guy. And when I was there, it was the same weekend as the Open Championship that was at St. Andrews. So we had the golf on constantly. And I was asking about, where he's been in the US to golf. And he said his favorite place that he had played golf at in America, the two that he said, Baltusrol, which is also in part of the rotation. Baltusrol is in New Jersey.
1993 US Open. Yeah.
Yep. And Marion. He said he's played the course at Marion. So when I mentioned to him about cricket and all that, he knew exactly where Marion Cricket Club is because he'd been to play at Marion Golf Club across the street.
Yeah.
So there's so many links like that are kind of tangential links or slightly just on the periphery.
Yeah.
Where if you're involved in the sports culture in the US, if you got your eyes open, you'll see where the links are with cricket and how closely linked and how many ties and rubbing shoulders moments.
And that's the thing, it's a shame that it hasn't kicked on a bit, because I've been asked about cricket in the US ever since I've lived here, and I've been involved in some of the efforts to to get it to reach a broader audience. But my opinion on it is that until the kids are playing it in the street or in their backyard or at school, they will struggle in the US. I mean, I'm the biggest fan of promoting the game as there is in this country, but you can't just rely on expat population to keep the game going here. It has to be homegrown support, and gradually I think that will happen, but they'll always struggle. But and the other surprising things is the pockets of cricket that you do find. I mean, having done the minor league for 2 seasons now, last year when we first did that first final in Morrisville, I was talking to the guys down there, and there's 10,000 registered players in that Triangle Cricket League down there. I mean, it's astonishing, and they'll have up to 2,500 kids a week in clinics. People don't realise the extent of the support in those local areas, but outside that area, people don't know about it. But that's part of the problem in bringing it to a wider audience.
The Stars and Stripes Cricket Podcast is presented by DreamCricket. DreamCricket Store can help you fill up all of your cricket kit requirements. Anything you need: bats, helmets, gloves, pads, jerseys, and more. Go to DreamCricketStore.com now and get 15% off your first order. DreamCricket Store also offers free shipping on all orders over $200. Again, go to www.dreamcricketstore.com to take advantage of that great offer today. This episode of the Stars and Stripes Cricket Podcast, presented by Dream Cricket, is also sponsored by Moosa Cricket Stadium, the first turf wicket facility in the state of Texas, and now the first ODI-accredited venue in the Lone Star State, located at 5515 McKeever Road, County Road 100 in Pearland, 5 miles off the Bailey Road exit from State Route 288, a half hour south of downtown Houston. Moosa Cricket Stadium includes fully enclosed locker rooms and change rooms, plus shower facilities after a day's play, as well as outdoor nets for all your training needs. Moosa also has 2 nursery grounds on the north side of the stadium boundary available for use. For more information, visit www.moosastadium.com. That's MOOSA Stadium.com. Moosa Cricket Stadium in Pearland, Texas. The Stars and Stripes Cricket Podcast is also sponsored by Crickbuster. Based in Florida, Crickbuster is an ICC-designated official travel agent for the 2022 ICC Men's T20 World Cup in Australia. If you're a cricket fan living in the USA and you need match tickets, flights, hotels, stadium tours, or want to organize other sightseeing activities down under this October, Crickbuster is a one-stop shop for all of your touring needs. Visit www.crickbuster.com to begin planning your trip today. And now back to the episode.
New York City is one place where they're trying, or they have historically tried. I mean, they've had the PSAL High School League going there now for 15 years, since 2008.
Thanks to Mike Bloomberg. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember, former police commissioner Ray Kelly coming out to support PSL and the NYPD cricket. I mean, so it wasn't just like a half-ass thing that they just did just to placate a few people. You had like prominent people in the political community coming out to support. I mean, Ray Kelly, like, at least at that point in time for me, it was like, gee, whoa, Ray Kelly, this is kind of a big deal.
It's the real deal. Yeah.
Ray Kelly's showing up for the cricket. And, it wasn't like I got to be here for, they weren't like checking the watch. How long do I have to be here? Come on, what was it? He
wasn't looking for the next appointment.
The George Bush presidential debate in 200004, whatever. He's like looking at his watch.
He's got somewhere to be. Yeah.
Yeah. But, there was none of that. Ray Kelly was there. It wasn't like, oh, come on, have I met my time? Let's go. He stayed. They had like a media scrum where he answered some questions, and after that, in theory, he could have left, but he stayed and he kept on watching the match, and he was quite engaged. And when I talked to him,
so many people are when they start watching how engaged they do become.
Well, and when I talked to him, the chance that I got to speak with him for a few minutes, I asked him, what do you think this? And I was kind of naive or almost. I'm guilty of being condescending about it. I was like, oh, what do you think of this? Or, what do you think of what's going on here? He says, this is my first time. He's like, I've been to plenty of cricket matches before. He's like, I love it. Like, I know what's going on. Like, you don't need to explain it to me. I was like, oops, made a fool of myself in front of Ray Kelly.
That's right. There's a latent following then, if you will. I mean, back in 2004, I was approached to do the American Pro League. I don't know if you remember that.
Cricket, of course.
American Pro Cricket. And of course, I thought, what are these guys trying to do? These minor league grounds. And so I went and produced those. And the East, I could do the games on the East, and then I
that was
had
it.
A guy help
they
me
played
on the
at the Somerset Patriots Stadium.
Yeah, and we also played at the Yankee Stadium in Staten Island.
Staten Island Yankees, yep. The Richmond Bank Ballpark.
Yeah, and what a great location. But again, because it's a small baseball field, it's not ideal for cricket. But again, it was a good idea, fairly poorly executed at the time. They had a few expat players from national teams. Colin Miller was there, and I think Franklin Stevenson came up from the West Indies, and there were a few.
Mervyn Dillon was there.
Merv Dillon, yeah.
Robin Singh played in it.
Robin Singh, he did too. And the problem with that league was, at the time, they'd set up what was called the DESI network. They were trying to have as the expat subcontinent people living in the US, to cater to them news, current affairs, soap operas from home, sports, which of course needed to be cricket. So they really good idea to have it to start up a franchise cricket league. But their idea of marketing at the time, the owner of the league, or one of the guys involved with the league, owned a series of supermarkets in New Jersey. And his idea of marketing was putting the dates of the matches on the bags, and the paper bags where you put your groceries. That was how that was marketed. And it was a shame, because they had a commissioner, and they were supposed to be funded for 3 years. And after the first year, it just went poof. So
they did the XFL.
Then, of course, everyone rolls their eyes and says, cricket will never make it. And, and then someone else tries to do it. And some of the less reliable, shall we say, people get involved in years following that. And,
so they did an XFL. They tried to do a Vince McMahon. We'll do the XFL for 3 years, and then after year one, they pulled the plug.
Yeah, that's just a shame. And that's why it's gratifying to be part of this organization now that's doing minor league and major league cricket. I think they're in much better hands now than they have been in the past. So that's gratifying.
Well, pro cricket, I'm going to go back to this. So at that point in time, I was not involved in cricket community at that point. At that point in time, when pro cricket was happening, I was either a student at a Creighton University out in Nebraska. I was working Creighton basketball games or Creighton baseball games for the College World Series, or I was in Australia doing my semester abroad around 2004, 2005. So I had no concept of cricket in New Jersey or anywhere else for that matter in America. What do you remember about that point in time in terms of the broad scale attempt to launch a pro cricket league, and why you feel more than anything else it failed? It failed generally. The operation failed, and kind of big picture why it failed to catch on in kind of a a sporting sense, or just within the cricket community itself, it wasn't really supported?
Well, they appeared to have some support financially to start with, but I don't think they looked broadly enough. I don't think they looked at it as a bigger picture, and I think that was to their detriment. I guess you could say they didn't aim high enough. I don't think, though. I think they were happy just to do it, to make it like a regional event, even though they had teams down. You know, they had 4 teams on the east and 4 teams on the west. In theory, it never felt like it was much more than local cricket. Local cricket just turned up a little bit on the volume, and I think that was part of the problem. And the guys running it weren't thinking big picture, and had they had some good advice at the time, it may have worked better. They had a little bit of a splash when it was first launched, but it came out of the blue to me. I got a phone call from a guy in England asking me if I could put the TV cruise together. I said, sure, I can do that, but for what? You know, how come I haven't heard about this? And to hear about it from someone in England was that kind of shows you that there wasn't not a lot of news about it in this country. So, like I said, it was a shame that it didn't go further. But I think the way it was executed was they didn't have the right people running it at the time. I think it can be boiled down to.
But in terms of, say, I mean, if you look at minor league cricket now, there are some people who would say the same thing, that it's very localized in terms of the way the franchises are and the locations and all that. But there has been some measure of success, comparatively speaking. And I'm curious why you think there has been success compared to pro cricket, when in some ways the approaches in terms of outreach and recruitment and who's actually featuring the teams themselves has in a lot of ways been quite similar.
Well, it may appear to be similar. I think it may be partly because the people involved are probably more serious about the way their resources are used than perhaps they were in the pro cricket days. And I think the overall structure of the league has much better organisation than they had done. It was as we used to say in Australia and England, it was back of a fag packet, plan back in 2004. But this time around, with the people that they've employed and the strategic plan that they've set forward to, roll out Major League Cricket, I think is vastly different to the way it was planned back in 2004. And I think there are a lot better people involved in terms of organisation. I'm sure they have problems, at franchise level. And in my opinion, there are too many teams. Yeah. You don't need 27 teams.
And I agree with that.
But all the guys that are willing to pony up the money to buy a franchise were willing to exactly do that. So I think it's a little bit unwieldy, the size of it. And we found that out a little bit this year, the way we covered our premium streams. But, it's still, I don't think the structure is the problem at the moment. I still think the main issue in the US, of course, is venues, appropriate venues.
Well, but on that point, I would say minor league cricket is in much better position than pro cricket ever was. I mean, if pro cricket, correct me if I'm wrong, pro cricket, none of the matches were played on natural turf cricket wickets, right? No. So it was all, minor league or, San Francisco, they had Kezar Stadium they used which is like nowadays is a track and field venue, I think, and used to be where the 49ers played way back when. But, if you compare that now, just in terms of the infrastructural landscape, whether MLC and ACE have invested in it or prior to their arrival, you've got places like Morrisville, which ACE and MLC have not had any involvement with prior to the launch of minor league cricket and Major League Cricket. That was there, started in 2014, 2015. So that's a decade after pro cricket. You've got this wonderful facility that's been constructed in Morrisville, which is good enough to host the finals weekend on back-to-back years. You've got the facilities in Houston, in Pearland, and then out in Prairie View. And, even so, it's not perfect, right? You've got it's not universal where you've got turf wickets. Philadelphia doesn't have one in the Midwest. St. Louis doesn't have one. You've got some other venues. They don't have the New York venues, the New York franchises. They don't have.
Well, the climate, you can't have the turf wickets to be surviving as properly. I mean, you can keep them alive over winter, but I mean, it's a hard thing to do when the cricket isn't played at the proper, the upper level constantly. It's an investment in funds again. You know, the turf wickets are going to obviously thrive more in the places with a better climate that suits that. So I don't think they'll ever get around that problem.
Well, but you say that. I always disagree with this point, though, because last time I checked, it snows in England. It snows in Melbourne.
Yeah.
It snows in other parts of the world where it snows.
Yeah, but it snows. It's not the snow, Peter. It's that hard freeze. And that's for a long period of time, you know.
But you
don't get that in England.
You have, well, yeah, no, you don't get. You get it maybe in Scotland a little bit, not quite.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you do have variable weather conditions. Is the point, and people, it needs expertise, right? You can't just have Joe Schmo looking after the wickets. You need somebody who's got an expertise in looking after the soil content in the grass and all that, which is challenging. And it costs money, and that's a problem, obviously. But you know, things like even with those challenges in minor league, where not every location, it's not universal, there's turf wicket available. One of the things I like they did this year was that 4th of July weekend, where they just scheduled around holiday weekend, where they just told everybody, you're all flying to Houston, or you're all flying to North Carolina, and we're going to do kind of a festival type weekend where we build a production around it. But also, just to force people to say, all right, if this is the highest standard league that's going to be played, we're going to try and get as many matches played in the highest standard facilities. So they force everybody to go there. And I thought it was a great initiative just to build it around a holiday weekend, but also just to show a little bit of out of the box thinking and creativity, to say, this is something we're trying to do to change the culture of cricket and how it's played and why it's played and where it should be played. And I would like to see more things like that done, just kind of to do, again, around a holiday weekend, whether that's Labor Day weekend or 4th of July weekend or Memorial Day weekend, stuff like that, to do kind of a focused impact kind of event type thing like that. And hopefully that'll encourage the local municipality to say, like, well, if Morrisville can do it and if Pearland can do it, there's nothing stopping New York. You know, why can't New York do it? At the end of the day, while those one-off weekends are good, I feel like the converse model that you see Global T20 Canada do, where you see some of the other franchise leagues do, where it's all games at one site, I think it's just a colossal failure for a variety of reasons. I'm curious to hear your views on this, because I know from a TV production standpoint, I've talked to other producers and directors, and they think it's the greatest thing ever, because you get all the equipment in one place. You never have to move it. You can keep the production consistent. There's no challenges from that standpoint. But from a fan standpoint, one city cannot be exhausted to the point where the onus is on them to buy all the tickets to show up to all the matches all the time. And it's a bit phony as well to say the Vancouver Knights of Brampton or the Vancouver Knights of Toronto have won the championship. Like, you have to have a genuine home base following, or else in the American market specifically, people will see right through that. Nobody's going to buy into this phony concept of.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I mean, that's part of developing a league like this, Peter. You can't, there have to be compromises made all the way along until there are proper venues. If the Vancouver team or the Seattle team or wherever it is who's playing in another ground, if they don't have their own venue, what are we going to do? We can't say, well, we're not going to include these guys. It's kind of a balance.
And there shouldn't be a franchise in Seattle. If they don't have their own ground, we're seeing that in baseball right now.
That's right.
The city of Oakland doesn't want to build a new stadium for the A's, or the A's ownership doesn't want to privately finance their own stadium. Well, guess what? If they can't find a new suitable venue to replace the Oakland Coliseum,
go somewhere where they can.
Then they're going to go to Nashville, or they're going to go somewhere else, or Portland.
Well, as you know, they're doing something in Seattle is going to be built. You know, the city of Seattle is putting in to help with the venue, right? So and various other cities are too, but they all have to be multi-use venues. This is the reality of setting up essentially a new sport. It's not really a new sport, as you and I have talked about, but it is for a lot of people. It's a new sport in the US, and there aren't many old grounds that can just be instantly refurbed to be economically viable, you know, at the drop of a hat. That just can't happen. So in the meantime, to keep the interest levels up, they have to use what they have. And I can't really fault them too much for that. I mean, obviously, as a producer of cricket in various parts of the world, I mean, I've done stuff at Lord's. I mean, it's a lot easier for me to get things done there than it is in Prairie View. But we have what we have. And I'm not a big fan of putting a product out to the world. They're trying to promote cricket in the US, and it doesn't look right. For me,
when you say it doesn't look right, so what what do you mean by that specifically?
Well, I mean, it doesn't. You're playing in grounds that the surface of the if you're playing on an artificial wicket somewhere, even in Philadelphia, I mean, it's lovely ground out there, the ground where they play.
Yeah.
But it's not a turf wicket, and they've got various colours of covering on there, and it just doesn't look quite right. It looks too, as the old saying, it looks very village. And
so you're not even talking from a TV production standpoint. You're not talking about general TV production. You're talking about just like the most basic element of cricket. If the ground doesn't look right and you project that on a TV screen.
Exactly. And we're sending that to people. We're asking people to pay rights for us to send that to them. You want to give them a product that looks as close as to what they're expecting to see as normal. Now they have to have their expectations tempered a little bit too. We can't have it's not every place isn't going to look like Eden Gardens, but it's one of those things where it's important, the look of the product that you're putting out there. And some grounds are better than others, let's just say that. Morrisville's not perfect, but it is a whole lot better than some of the other places we visited this summer. And, the final product that we put out there, I've had generally really good response from the type of broadcast that came out of Morrisville, even though at normal cricket level, we were restricted in resources as well. But we try to make it look as good as possible. And the end product is what is going to be judged upon when potential investors are either continually interested or they think, no, this is not worth it and go somewhere else. So that's part of the problem with doing the broadcast for emerging leagues, is that you try and have as good a product as possible to show potential investors and sponsors.
Well, let me ask you this. Morrisville is an incredibly challenging place to do a broadcast because there's no permanent infrastructure there. When you bring your crew in, you've got to bring in all sorts of trucks and try and put in temporary scaffolding towers to get cameras in the right positions and all that kind of thing, right? So even though the production element is probably 10 times more challenging than, say, a fixed venue like Citi Field for the All-Stars, where you've got broadcast infrastructure and the wiring and all that for cameras, in your mind, what do you feel makes for a better production from a cricket standpoint, doing it at a genuine cricket venue like Morrisville, where you have to jump through 20 hoops to set up all the broadcast things that you need to do from your end, or Citi Field, where it looks fancier because it's a stadium, but from a cricket standpoint, it's kind of half-assed in one sense?
Well, there's no question. I'll jump through all the hoops necessary to make it work at Morrisville. I mean, because it looks like a cricket ground, and I'd rather go through the challenges of setting up the broadcast at a venue that looks to be a cricket venue rather than an easier technically speaking set up at a ground that's not a cricket ground. So there's no question about that.
So from that standpoint, as a follow-up, all right, we got the 2024 World Cup coming up. USA is supposed to go host it. There's been talks of potentially games being staged at Oakland Coliseum, especially if the A's jump out of town and before the thing gets demolished, to have one last hurrah.
Yeah.
But from your standpoint, whether as a producer director on a cricket broadcast or as a fan of the sport in general, what do you think would be more appealing or a better projection to the world of cricket in America and what American cricket is capable of sending out to the world and building on? Would you want to see more games being played and broadcast and produced in Morrisville and Lauderhill and potentially one other venue, whether that's Dallas, this Airhawk Stadium that they're trying to convert, or one of the Houston venues? Or do you think it would be better to stage games with, Morrisville can only hold maybe 4,000 people, but it's a cricket ground, versus Oakland Coliseum, which could have 55,000 people, but it's going to look very makeshift from a cricket standpoint?
Yeah, it's arguments on both sides there, and I'll accept them both. But from my personal view, I'd rather be watching a game at that level at a cricket ground, because the automatic assumption, if you're looking at, you might have 20 or 30 or 40,000 people, and I don't know if you'll get that at Oakland Coliseum anyway, but even if you did, the look of it, the first thing people are going to say, well, this is a little bit, second rate. If it's in a football ground or a baseball ground, they're not even serious about a cricket ground. Now that's to the casual observer, obviously, and to the cricket fanatic, it's obvious criticism. You're distracted by the fact that it's not a setup for cricket. Now, conversely, as you say, you can't, the limited numbers that can be fit into a ground like Morrisville or upcoming Air Hog Stadium, or even Prairie View, you've got obviously limitations there, but at least it looks like a cricket ground. And Lauderhill, for all its warts and all, I've done a few things there over the years. It's again not perfect, but it's about as good as you can get at the current level of investment and interest in cricket in the US. And it's a pity, because ICC needs to have grounds if they're going to host serious games in the US. Going forward, they need grounds that can actually pass ICC level. I mean, when we were doing the first weekend of minor league, we did at Woodley Park in Los Angeles, and I was doing the production from Utah. We had the small truck and our crew going around doing the premium streams. Me and my business partner in Antares Media, Kevin McGee, and I were in Utah producing the show there. And I was in between matches. The production manager said, "Oh, we've got someone here in the truck wants to talk to you." And it was Johnny Grave, who was the CEO of the Cricket West Indies. Yep. And he's an old friend, and he wanted to know why I wasn't at the ground. And we explained to him the reality of doing this and the resources available. And he's very familiar with that, being involved with Cricket West Indies. And he was on a tour around with the ICC people, looking at potential venues for the upcoming World Cup in 2024. And he was at Woodley Park because we were playing the minor league there. And I said, "Well, Johnny, let me guess that Woodley Park won't be on the list." And he goes, "Yeah, that's pretty much true." I said I was surprised to actually see them there. But he was saying privately that there hadn't been many that he saw that would make the grade. So it shows you that it's a struggle, but at least they're trying. And I think they need to be applauded for that.
No, 100%. Now, going way back, how does Guy, growing up in Sydney and regional New South Wales, Gosford, you said you spent a lot of time in Sydney, but growing up in Gosford, New South Wales, how does a guy growing up on a sheep farm get involved in cricket production?
Well, geez, this is going. I don't know how I can keep this compact, this discussion. Gosford is actually like a bedroom community of Sydney. It's not the farming area itself. It's about an hour north. It's mainly commuters to Sydney. We grew up it's a surfing culture. Me and my family grew up on the coast, surfing every day and fishing. But my dad's family came from further north in the northern tablelands of New South Wales on a family farm that's been in our family since the 1880s. And it's known for that the region is the New England area of New South Wales, it's called, and it's known for its superfine merino wool and Poll Hereford cattle. And we've been involved in that all our lives. So we were taken there, rightly or wrongly, every weekend or every other weekend or school holidays. And not unbeknownst to us at the time, we learned about farming. We learned about grazing. Raising animals, doing all the things that happen. Now that it's been handed down to us, we're still doing it. My brother is still running our share of the farm there. My sister runs the other half with her husband, and we are continuing the family tradition. So I do go home a couple of times a year, as I say to my brother, to pretend to help him a couple of times a year. But we have fun. He's a cricket tragic as well, because we all grew up in the cricketing family. My great grandfather played in the first ever New South Wales team. Now there's some interesting stories about him as well. I mean, in those days in Sydney, he was a bit of a larrikin. I mean, he played with 12 years old. He was asked to play in the military team on the old site of St Andrew's Cathedral in Sydney, and they used to, at the time, it was a cemetery with the current site of the cathedral, and they used to move the headstones so they could have more room to play cricket. And of course, the cops weren't real happy with that. So he spent a few days in the lockup as a 12-year-old because he was caught moving headstones to play cricket. So it goes back, and my mum's brother had a groundman named after him before he died, which is a rare honour in Australia. So he played grade cricket until he was in his 60s. So cricket goes way back in my family. She used to brag, my mum used to brag about 1934 Australian touring team to England, where the radio stations used to put on a competition. If you could pick the touring team, you'd win a prize. And of course, in later years, it was you'd tour with the team. But in the 1930s, it wasn't quite so extraordinary. She picked the team that included Arthur Chipperfield in the team. And of course, for some reason, she loved it. She was a 13-year-old girl. And for some reason, she liked this guy, and he got picked in the squad. She won it. And her prize was a guided tour of the radio station. So she took great pride in telling us about that all our lives. So we were very fortunate having a life in sort of rural area as well as urban area blend. It was great. After I kind of got into the broadcast business, more so in the US than in Australia. I was working on feature films there from an aviation background. I was an Air Force pilot, and I got out of there, and I taught people to fly for a while, and was hired in a film logistics company in Australia. And we used to send, at the time, there was a lot of investment in film in Australia by the government. They were offering big tax breaks. So there were a lot of films being made in the 80s in Australia, including Crocodile Dundee, which I have a credit on. And, I did over 50 feature films, and then I moved to the US, and the type of work I'd been doing in film business in Australia didn't really exist here. So I sort of gravitated towards TV, and have come all the way since. I started out as a spotter for the ABC Sports in 1992 US Open at Pebble Beach, and worked my way through the compound, essentially every job there was going, as a graphics operator, as a graphics coordinator, highlights producer, all working all the way up through producer and director. So I've done a lot of golf, a lot of cricket, 10 Olympics, a couple of Emmys on the shelf, and I feel fairly gratified that I've kind of made it work as well as I could in the US, but I was always cricket starved. That's my point then, Peter. I always had to gravitate towards the cricket, turn down jobs now so I can do cricket. I've just come off the US Open tennis and directing for ESPN, and there was a talk, it was a cricket event supposed to be happening in Canada at the time. And I was tossing up whether I'd turn down the US Open as a home game, 5 minutes from my house, and go to Canada to do cricket. But my wife made me see sense.
The lot to unpack there. Which is a bigger point of pride for you, having a credit in Crocodile Dundee or all the sports stuff?
I think directing cricket at Lords, I'd rather have than a credit on Crocodile Dundee or the Emmys. So that's, for me, it's all about the cricket, and having done so many years in the Caribbean, and I've made so many friends down there with some of the former players and announcers, and I'm happy to say I gave a lot of them their first go in broadcast TV, and that's very gratifying for me to call some of these people friends. Guys that I used to just watch playing cricket, couldn't believe how good they were when they toured Australia, and I'd be part of the raucous crowd in Australia drinking beers and hoping Australia would beat the West Indies. But these guys were just incredible. I was one of the guys back in the 60s, and back in the black and white days, Peter, listening on the transistor radio on my bed at the Australian tour of the West Indies. Couldn't believe that so far away on the other side of the world, they could be playing cricket while it's 2:00 in the morning in Australia. So, just captivated me the entire time. And I guess I'm still a big kid in that respect.
One of the other things you touched on, there's an awful lot of parts of a broadcast and working your way up through the industry in different roles. And when I was first getting into kind of broadcasting stuff way back when, there is such a thing as a sports broadcasting camp. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Peter Steve, but Bruce Beck and Iron Eagle. Bruce Beck, who is you know,
good friend of mine, Bruce. Yeah.
Bruce Beck. Bruce Beck and Iron Eagle run a sports broadcasting camp at Montclair State University.
Yeah,
and I was in their second year, their second batch, and then I was an intern for them for I can't remember if I did it for 1 or 2 summers, but at their camp, it's all these teenage kids, high school graduating kids and first year college who have dreams of being a sports broadcaster, and they go to this camp at Montclair State, and it's at the Yogi Berra Museum at Montclair State University that Bruce Beck.
I'm very familiar. Yeah.
You know all about it. So I was there, and one of the things they told me was never say no. You get an opportunity, any part of the broadcast, you know, you're not gonna be doing play-by-play from day one. So
no, that's right.
You get offered something to say yes. So when I went to Creighton and I was working the athletic department as my work study job, I mean, one of the first things I did, I was a flag runner. You know, for the marketing team, they needed somebody to run the flag to lead the basketball team onto the court after the you know, the sizzle video, the pump up video, you know, 3 minutes before the start of the tip off and all that. I did the same thing for
and
the
then
soccer.
A red hat, I'm sure. I guess you were a red hat at some point.
The flag was scary because it's so unbalanced when you're running with it. If you don't kind of tilt it forward as you're running, you can take a tumble.
Oh, geez. And
that was
you well in your broadcast career.
but like, you know, that was the scariest thing I've ever done in broadcasting or to do with a game production in-house or television was running a flag onto the field. Because the only thing that was going through my mind was, if I trip and fall, or if the wind knocks me over, I'm going to fall on my face in front of 20,000 people, and they're all going to laugh at me. I'll never live it down.
It'll make the ESPN highlights reel.
Yeah. That was my ticket. Maybe I should have done it. Maybe I should have just a strategic tumble. Could have made it on not top 10. But one of the early things I did in terms of the Creighton broadcast productions that were either in-house or to the whether it was the local sports affiliates or if it was the Big East Network or, you know, prior to that, Missouri Valley Conference, whatever, was, you know, I worked camera. So first I worked the end zone camera and the soccer games, and it was tracking corner kicks and, you know, ball tracking from there if there was something interesting. I mean, then I was good enough on that where I got promoted to do the ball fall from center, you know, the 50-yard line, whatever, midfield, doing the ball fall camera. And so doing camera operating work. And then there was other parts of different productions that was on where I remember doing baseball games where we sat in a truck or some other vantage point, and whoever was doing graphics didn't have a view of the field. And so something as simple as me relaying to a graphics person, ball strike, every time there was ball or strike, I had to tell them what the call was. So then they could, you know, people think it's automatic. On the screen, you know, they just add, you know,
you have to update their graphic. Yeah.
You got to update the graphic. Somebody's updating it. It's not automatic.
Yeah.
They do it physically. And I had to be the one through a headset to tell them, you know, ball strike, to tell them so they could change the count manually on screen, all that kind of thing. I did other I was a stats crew person, again, doing statistical work and helping out with entering statistical graphics in for broadcast. So I got to do various roles before I got an opportunity to do play-by-play. And so I got an appreciation for all the different aspects of a broadcast. Yeah. And there's so many nuanced things and so many people were part of the team, and the transitions. You know, one of the other things I did was at basketball games, I worked the stadium, essentially the sound machine. I was like a de facto DJ where, you know,
the in-house PA.
Yeah. No. Well, no. So it's kind of like a two-pronged thing. I sat next to the stadium PA announcer, and I had the sound effects and all that control. So like if he was going to read a promo over the PA, I had to communicate with him to lower the music or shut off the music if it was, you know, Zombie Nation or some other pump up song. You know, Creighton goes on a 12-0 run. You know, Villanova at the time would have been Missouri State or Illinois State or Indiana State calls a timeout. You know, boom, second whistle blows, referee, I'm hitting Zombie Nation, you know, everybody's going bonkers, whatever. But then at some point, I've got to kind of lower the music levels a little bit so the PA announcer can read, you know, that 70th point means Godfather's Pizza, you know, all that kind of nonsense, whatever. Yeah. So there's so many things that go into it and behind the scenes. And you said you got to work your way up. When you were working your way up, what was your favorite role of all the kind of different roles you had behind the scenes leading up to what you do now?
Jeez, I never really thought about that. I got to say, probably way back when, starting as a spotter, walking with the golfers in a US Open, literally walking inside there with the golfers. So I would be talking back to the truck to say, just telling them who's hitting first. It was like being paid to be, you know, the greatest spectator there was. I mean, that was, there's a lot of pressure on you because you don't want to get yelled at if you give them the wrong information. But it was the greatest thing ever. And then when you get into the truck itself and you're doing graphics or you're doing audio or you're doing highlights or whatever, there's even more pressure on you. There's just more and more pressure each job to get you go along with. But I got to say, that was probably the most enjoyable, to be quite honest. I mean, now, directing some of these big shows, you got to make sure that the people you have around you are the ones that you want and you feel most comfortable with, which is part of the art of putting on a good broadcast, is making sure all the people around you are much better than you are. And that's always very gratifying. But in terms of pure fun, walking with Ernie Els or Tiger or whatever, that was one of the most fun things. Now that doesn't relate to cricket broadcasting because you don't get to do that. You can hang out with the players while they're warming up, or you can, maybe have a beer with the hotel after work. During the Stanford series, that was one of the great things. Back in 2007, I produced, the Alan Stanford's T20 Caribbean style, and we all stayed at they'd employed all these former players as legends to be hanging around. So it was Viv Richards, and it was Curtly Ambrose, and it was Joel Garner, and it was all these guys that were just the guys that you love to watch. And that was fun too. That was not part of the broadcast, but it was fun hanging out, drinking beers with Courtney Walsh and Viv Richards. That part of it is good, being a fanboy. But the most fun part for the going through the motions of getting to where I am now, I think, was at the outset where you knew very little about what was going on in the truck, but you just wanted to make sure you gave the right information while you were watching the golf.
Well, Peter Steep just opened up Pandora's box by name-dropping Alan Stanford there, and that's going to take up a good portion of part 2 of the interview with Peter Steep, where he goes in-depth discussing what it was like to work for Alan Stanford on the broadcast production side of the Stanford 2020 tournament, and subsequently the 2020 for $20 million match against England, and all things to do with Alan Stanford, regardless of the notorious crime dealings that Alan Stanford was eventually convicted for. So it's definitely worth listening to or watching if you access the podcast on YouTube or on Spotify or Anchor FM. This is one of the more compelling interviews you'll listen to, especially because there's not an awful lot of people who have really spoken publicly about what it was like to work for Alan Stanford in that time frame on the cricket side of things. So be sure to tune into that. I want to once again remind everybody, if you haven't already done so, go to patreon.com, become a patriot, become an eagle, become a captain, support the podcast on an episode-by-episode basis. And as I just mentioned, all the other avenues to get the latest episode of the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Anchor FM, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. If you haven't already subscribed through any of those platforms, be sure to do so. But until next time, that's it for this episode. I'm Peter Della Penna, reminding everybody, God bless America, and God bless American cricket.